I'm so sorry to ask, but could you possibly take me to the hospital? I dragged my aching body and finally made it to my mother-in-law's door, pleading with her. However, when she opened the door, to my surprise, she was all packed up with a suitcasito go on a trip. Since Emily's got a cold and staying here might just get me sick too, I'm heading off to a spa vacation with some friends. And look at this mess. Make sure you clean up. My mother-in-law quickly left for her trip. I couldn't believe it. My mother-in-law had offered to live with us, claiming she wanted to help out since my husband was often away on business trips and I was pregnant. Yet she never helped with the housework or childcare, and now, in this emergency, she was abandoning us. I was struggling to stay conscious. If I collapsed, what would happen to my daughter left all alone? I couldn't let her be alone. With the last of my strength, I reached out for help from someone. And it unexpectedly led to revenge on my mother-in-law. What she would face after her true nature was revealed. I'm Emily. I live with my husband and our 2-year-old daughter, Holly. My husband and I met in college. I'm from a rural area in Kentucky, moved to an apartment near the college for my studies, while my husband was a local, commuting from home. We started dating during our college years. I had visited his parents' home a few times, where I met his parents. His father would say, having a daughter must feel something like this, treating me like his own daughter. However, my mother-in-law didn't seem to think highly of me. Through our conversations, I learned that her family owned substantial local land, and she seemed to have a strong attachment to local traditions, disliking the fact that I came from another area. She would often complain in front of me, "There are plenty of good girls around here." But neither my father-in-law nor my husband paid her much heed, and she seemed unapologetic. Despite this, I hoped we could get along better over time. After graduating and 2 years into our marriage, we had our daughter. My father-in-law, celebrating our marriage and pregnancy, built us a house on their land, and we started our new life there. The area, being a new residential district, was selling plots rapidly. Our neighborhood was filled with young couples and families with young children like ours. We quickly became friends with our neighbors, enjoying a comfortable and welcoming community. My pregnancy went smoothly, and Holly was born without any issues. My father-in-law adored her. But my mother-in-law acted distant towards Holly, not trying to get too close. Possibly because of her dislike for me and her germophobia, reacting excessively if Holly reached out to her after being held by my husband. Seeing her like that made me very sad, and I felt sorry for my daughter. But I wondered if it was just something we had to accept if my mother-in-law was a germaphobe. As a daughter-in-law, I felt I couldn't say anything. Despite the awkwardness at my in-laws, at home, I enjoyed a relaxed and happy parenting experience. Holly was adorable, and the community of young families around us meant she had plenty of children her age to play with, preventing any feelings of isolation in parenting. Our neighbors, particularly one family with a child the same age as Holly and the wife my age, became close friends, often sharing meals and outings together. 2 years after Holly was born, I became pregnant with our second child. Luckily, my morning sickness was mild, but managing my energetic daughter while feeling unwell was challenging. My husband, thrilled about the pregnancy, had recently been transferred to a department with frequent business trips, adding to his worry for us. The support from our neighbors, offering help whenever needed, gave me strength. During this time, we lost my father-in-law. My father-in-law had a history of heart problems, and one morning, he collapsed from chest pain. It was a heart attack. My mother-in-law called an ambulance immediately, and he was rushed to the hospital, but he passed away before we could get there. My husband, daughter, and I hurried to the hospital as soon as we got the call, but by the time we arrived, my father-in-law was already gone. My mother-in-law, devastated, wept openly, while my husband comforted her. Holly, still too young to understand, looked confused. I cherished the memory of our last visit to my in-laws, where my father-in-law had been so happy about our growing family. He was so happy for us, and he always looked out for my well-being. My father-in-law said, you're going to be a big sister, huh," as he hugged Holly with so much love. Seeing him like that made me feel incredibly happy. I adored my kind father-in-law as if he were my own father, and not being able to let him hold my second child was so painful that I couldn't stop my tears. After the funeral, life started to settle down. Today, we were helping my mother-in-law sort through my father-in-law's belongings. Her saying, "It's going to be tough without your father." Certainly, my father-in-law was far from being domineering. He was capable of handling anything around the house. From gardening and heavy lifting to cooking and cleaning, he was always proactive. Naturally, I thought it was understandable to feel lost without him suddenly around, and I felt sorry for my mother-in-law. Then, seemingly struck by a sudden good idea, she exclaimed, "That's it. Emily, you're pregnant and it must be tough, right? How about I move in with you guys? If I take over the household chores, it'll surely ease your burden." She proposed to me and my husband, smiling cheerfully. Honestly, I was worried about living with my mother-in-law. After all, she seemed to have some animosity towards me, not to mention her germophobia. I wondered if she could really live together with me and my daughter. But she seemed quite pleased with her brilliant idea, eagerly awaiting our response. My husband looked at me, as if asking, "What should we do?" Being pregnant, I knew I wouldn't be able to move around as much soon, and my husband was always away on business trips. With our 2-year-old daughter still requiring a lot of care, having an extra pair of adult hands around would certainly be reassuring. My husband was also worried about being away, and we could understand my mother-in-law feeling anxious about living alone after my father-in-law's sudden passing. Since my husband was an only child, we had agreed upon the possibility of living with his parents eventually. Though we hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Despite my reservations about the arrangement, I thought it might be better for everyone if I could just put up with it a little. So, I decided to accept living with my mother-in-law. In subsequent discussions, we decided that to keep my daughter's environment as stable as possible, my mother-in-law would move into our home, and she would help reduce my workload by taking on some household chores. As for what to do with her house, since my in-laws owned other properties, we decided to put off any decisions for the time being. Not long after our talks, my mother-in-law moved in, and our new living arrangement began. "I'm counting on you, Emily. Think of me as a real family and don't hesitate to ask for anything," she said with a smile. Though she had been rather cold to me before, it seemed she was trying to change her approach with the new living situation. I resolved to try my best to get along with her too. And responded, "Thank you, I'm looking forward to it." That day, we helped her unpack in the room we had prepared for her. The day after my mother-in-law moved in, my husband left for a 2-week business trip. I was determined to make the best of living with my mother-in-law and safeguarding the home in my husband's absence. A week into his trip, I had initially thought to gently show my mother-in-law how to use the washing machine and vacuum cleaner, considering she might still be getting used to our home. However, she didn't seem interested in doing any chores or looking after my daughter. Instead, she had requests that only increased my workload, like wanting her laundry done separately. "Emily, I prefer to separate my laundry from others. Could you run the washing machine for me separately? Or I'm a bit of a germaphobe, so I get concerned about the cleanliness of the bathroom. Could we increase the cleaning frequency?" I was puzzled and overwhelmed by my mother-in-law's demands, which she made as if they were the most natural thing in the world, and I struggled to meet them without objection. The initial agreement had been that living together would help ease my burden during pregnancy. Yet, so far, I was handling all the housework and childcare by myself, now doubled with the addition of my mother-in-law's share. While I rushed around, she would leisurely watch TV by herself. When my daughter tried to engage her in play, she would shoo her away. Understanding that her grandmother wouldn't play with her, my daughter stopped seeking her out. I also found myself unable to invite my mom friends over for a chat and playdates, which had been my way of relieving stress, out of consideration for my mother-in-law. I managed to get through the 2 weeks until my husband returned, despite not feeling well due to morning sickness. When my husband finally came back from his trip, My mother-in-law suddenly started taking initiative in household chores and cooking meals, as if the previous 2 weeks had never happened. During dinner, my husband thanked her for her help while he was away, and she responded as if she had been actively contributing all along, "It's nothing." I moved in with that intention, while cheerfully ignoring my astonished look. Even after, my mother-in-law only did the bare minimum of housework on nights when my husband was home. During the day, when he was at work or away on long business trips, she did nothing at all. I really needed her help when my husband wasn't around, but instead, my workload only increased. Unable to bear it any longer, I vented all my frustrations to my husband the night he returned from a business trip. I was hesitant to complain about his mother, but I was so stressed that I had to tell him everything. However, my usually kind and calm husband seemed unusually irritated and dismissively said, "I think Mom's just not used to living in our house yet. Why don't you try explaining things to her more clearly?" When I tried to press the issue, he cut me off, saying, "I'm swamped with work, especially with the busy season. I'm counting on you to handle things at home," before closing the door to the bathroom behind him. I felt helpless, realizing my pleas were falling on deaf ears. I regretted agreeing to this living arrangement. But now, it was too late for regrets. The only solace in this stressful living situation was venting to my neighbor during our walks. She was very concerned about my situation. It didn't change anything, but having someone listen and care made me feel a bit lighter. Then, during one of my husband's trips, I fell ill with a fever. My mother-in-law treated me like I was contagious, locking herself in her room even more than usual and, of course, not helping at all. Despite feeling sick, I still had to care for my daughter. But eventually, I reached my limit. My fever soared above 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and I felt so dizzy and weak that I could hardly stand, and my pregnant belly felt unusually tight and painful. As a last resort, I dragged myself to my mother-in-law's door and knocked, pleading, "I'm so sorry to ask, but could you please take me to the hospital?" I asked her with my last breath. When the door opened, I thought she might have been moved by my dire state. But instead of a worried expression, I was met by my mother-in-law dressed up with a suitcase in hand. "What?" Confused and feeling delirious from the fever, I froze as she said, "Since you've caught a cold, and I don't want to catch it too, I'm going on a spa trip with friends. I'll be back before he returns from his trip. Oh, and make sure you clean up this mess." With that, she left me there, staggering and alone. I had no strength left to stop her. I had depended on her as my last hope, and she had abandoned me without a second thought. Despairing over my mother-in-law's unbelievable actions, I felt like I was on the verge of losing consciousness, but I couldn't afford to collapse here, not with my daughter depending on me. Desperate, I decided to ask my neighbor for help. Even though we were close, I wondered if it was too much to ask, but I had no other choice. With the last of my energy, I carried my daughter to the neighbor's house and rang the doorbell. My neighbor immediately opened the door, seeing my distress, and listened as I explained my situation. After I finished speaking, I collapsed from exhaustion. Shocked, she called an ambulance for me. When I regained consciousness in the hospital, a nurse informed me that my daughter was being looked after by my neighbor and that I should rest easy. Grateful for my neighbor's kindness, I decided to stay in the hospital overnight for observation. After a night of treatments and rest, I felt better, though still feverish. I had an ultrasound to check on the baby, who was thankfully fine. Before going to my neighbor's to pick up my daughter, I stopped by my house to drop off some things, only to find my husband, who was supposed to be on a business trip, taking care of our daughter and waiting for me. Surprised, my daughter ran up to me, shouting, "Mommy." I hugged her and apologized to both her and my husband. "I'm so sorry for worrying you." My husband, looking unshaven and tired, hugged us back and tearfully apologized. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I had no idea things would get this bad." Although I had much to say, it was clear he had rushed back as soon as he heard what happened. "I heard everything from the neighbor, including what's been going on. Leave the rest to me, and just focus on resting," he said, taking over the care of our daughter and the household chores so I could rest in the bedroom. I took his advice and finally allowed myself some much-needed rest. 2 days after my mother-in-law left for her trip, she called our home. I was too sick to answer, and my husband, struggling with the unfamiliar chores, didn't pick up. It was our daughter who answered the phone. My mischievous daughter, Holly, has recently been on a phone call spree, enjoying chatting away. "Oh, did Holly pick up? Grandma's coming home now. Did your mom clean up properly?" It seems Holly answered the phone on speaker mode, making my mother-in-law's voice clearly audible. When asked, Holly responded in her baby talk. "Mommy. Got all hot." "Hot?" My mother-in-law's voice flipped in surprise. "She looked sick when I was leaving, but it couldn't be. Could she have collapsed and passed away?" My mother-in-law tried to clarify with Holly, but having had her fill of chatting, Holly hung up. I remembered what my neighbor had told me. When I collapsed at her place, she had called an ambulance. While I was being transported, she comforted my crying daughter by saying, "Holly's mommy got so hot from her fever, she almost burned up. But she'll be okay after resting." It seems Holly wanted to convey what the neighbor had told her to my mother-in-law, but obviously couldn't do it well. After the call, my panicked mother-in-law rushed home, only to be met by my husband. He had overheard the call from Holly to my mother-in-law and was waiting for her return. "Why are you here? Where's Emily? Holly said on the phone that she burned. What does that mean?" My mother-in-law was in a panic, surprised to find my husband, who was supposed to be away on a business trip, at home. "Where have you been?" My husband didn't answer her question but asked her, quietly yet with anger in his voice. Worried by my husband's demeanor, Holly and I peeked out from inside the house. My mother-in-law stammered, trying to make excuses, "It's not like that. I didn't know anything. Emily didn't tell me anything." But her eyes were darting everywhere, and her excuses were clearly desperate attempts to cover up the truth. "After you left for your trip, Emily collapsed from a high fever and was taken to the hospital by ambulance. I've heard about everything you've done to Emily so far. Even though I was busy with work, I'm furious at myself for not noticing sooner, but I'm even more disappointed in you. I can't live with someone who treats my family so carelessly. We're ending the living arrangement. Please leave immediately and don't contact us again," my husband declared, effectively disowning her. After a moment of shock, my mother-in-law trembled with anger and shouted at me, "This is all your fault for lying. You're the one who should be leaving." "I haven't lied about anything. You're the one who lied about wanting to help by moving in. Everything that's happened is the result of your own actions." I had always held back my true feelings around my mother-in-law. But with my husband's support and considering the danger she put me, Holly, and our unborn child in, I couldn't forgive her this time. I firmly rejected her. Stunned by my resistance, for I had never talked back to her before. My mother-in-law quickly tried to appeal to Holly with a sweet voice, "Holly, you want to live with Grandma, right?" However, her plan backfired when Holly loudly said, "No, Grandma, no." My mother-in-law was frozen in shock. It was natural for Holly to reject someone who didn't play with her and treated her as an inconvenience. My mother-in-law, not expecting Holly's rejection, packed her things under my husband's insistence and left for her own home. But the story didn't end there. Once I was feeling better, I invited my neighbor over for a chat, something I couldn't do while living with my mother-in-law. My neighbor mentioned, "I heard something from my mother recently." I realized I had heard this story from her before. During our conversation, it came to light that my neighbor was actually the daughter of one of my mother-in-law's friends. My mother-in-law, who had many friends due to being a prominent landowner, soon found her bullying behavior widely known among her circle, leading to her being ostracized. My mother-in-law occasionally called, crying and begging for forgiveness, asking me to mediate with her friends. But I refused, reminding her, as I said before, "You brought this on yourself. I'm busy, so excuse me." cut off by her friends and looked down upon by neighbors and relatives who heard about what happened from my husband, my mother-in-law lived in isolation. Despite her attempts to reconcile, my husband and I were done with her. I'm fed up with living with my mother-in-law and thinking about everything that's happened. I just want to keep my distance from now on. As the seasons changed, I safely gave birth to our second child, a boy. Holly adored her little brother and eagerly helped take care of him. Watching them, I vowed to be a strong mother who could properly raise her children.